Whether you fought for the North or the South, being a soldier in the Civil War was a harrowing experience. And with wounded, injured, and diseased soldiers being brought in at a rate faster than they could be attended to, Civil War field hospitals were almost as dangerous, chaotic, and stressful as the battlefields themselves. So, today we're going to take a look at what it was like to work in a Civil War hospital. Okay, get yourself scrubbed in, because it's time to operate on some weird history. The American Civil War raged from April 12, 1861 to May 26, 1865. The war would ultimately claim the lives of over 1 million Americans, 3% of the country's entire population at the time. Historians have noted that the Civil War claimed more American lives than all other wars the country has fought combined, despite the best efforts of those who worked in the field hospitals. Field hospitals were usually located close to the front lines, sometimes as close as just a mile away, which is a convenient walking distance, provided you hadn't just lost your foot to a cannon blast. If you were a soldier who was injured on the battlefield, a field hospital would be your first stop for medical care. They also tended to be improvised facilities that were set up in local buildings like barns, churches, or even private homes. The field hospitals typically had very little in the way of supplies, particularly in the South. Many of the medications that Civil War doctors needed were manufactured in the northern half of the United States. In order to gain access to these medicines, Southerners had to get creative. Sometimes that meant running Union blockades, or smuggling medicines to the South by sewing them into the petticoats of women who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. Surgeries were often performed on whatever flat surfaces were available, like tables or unhinged doors. They were also often performed outdoors, which not only helped to ventilate the extremely unpleasant war wound smell, but also allowed surgeons to use natural daylight during an operation instead of dim candlelight. Which was a good thing, because their eyes were perpetually tired from the sheer amount of surgeries that had to be performed. Nobody was prepared for the unprecedented human toll of the Civil War, so the surgeons wound up treating a lot more patients than anyone was expecting. Overwhelmed physicians often worked themselves past the point of exhaustion, and the circumstances created a generally chaotic and unnerving atmosphere. Patients had little to do but lay around. Some screamed deliriously and called out for loved ones, while others laid around quietly, looking pale from the effects of shock. Sounds like the DMV. Despite the best efforts of the surgeons, the hospitals tended to be perpetually crowded, and living conditions were so unfit for the wounded that many patients ended up perishing simply because of their hospital stay. Civil War soldiers fought in terrible conditions. In fact, twice as many soldiers succumbed to disease than to actual combat wounds. That sounds pretty bad, but it was actually a vast improvement over the numbers from the recent Mexican War, in which there were 7 to 10 disease-related fatalities for every combat fatality. Diarrhea and dysentery were extremely common and responsible for much of the death toll. Other prevalent diseases included measles, smallpox, malaria, pneumonia, and a weird skin condition known as camp itch, which is different from what you got from swimming in the lake that one summer. Luckily, doctors had an array of creative remedies at their fingertips, some of which actually worked. Scurvy was a fairly common problem among Civil War soldiers, and the remedy for it, regular servings of green vegetables, was among the least unpleasant, or most unpleasant, depending on how you feel about peas. Open bowel problems were treated with a plug of opium, while closed bowels were treated with an infamous mixture of mercury and chalk known as the blue mass. Respiratory issues like bronchitis or pneumonia were also treated with opium, or sometimes mustard or quinine plasters. If that didn't work, they might try bleeding the patient, the old-timey equivalent of drinking a glass of orange juice to get rid of a cold. Only to date, orange juice hasn't killed any presidents. Malaria, another common malady, was treated with quinine. If none of that was available, they used turpentine. The aforementioned camp itch, a painful skin disease whose cause is still a topic of debate in modern medicine, was treated by ridding the body of the pests or with a solution of poke root. Dead tissue surrounding an infection would sometimes be covered in maggots to eat away the necrotic skin. The hope here was that healthy tissue would then grow in its place. Now you can start to understand why all those hospitals needed to be in breezy tents. And if you got shot, well, they'd probably just offer you some whiskey to kill the pain. Unfortunately for a lot of their patients, Civil War-era medical professionals weren't too savvy about things like germs, so they didn't use sterilization or really any hygienic techniques. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients, wore filthy, blood-stained garments from one surgery to the next, and usually operated with unclean surgical instruments. That is, when they used surgical instruments at all. Reports of doctors probing wounds with bloody fingers or using dirty knives as scalpels were not uncommon, and surgical sponges would be lucky to get as much as a rinse between patients. Not surprisingly, infection and disease ran rampant through such facilities. Even worse, the unsanitary conditions contributed to the rise of a necrotizing fasciitis known as hospital gangrene. Nearly half of patients who contracted gangrene perished as a result. Unfortunately, not every soldier could be saved, and a lack of manpower, time, and equipment meant that tough decisions had to be made. If a soldier was shot in the stomach, head, or chest area, it likely meant they wouldn't survive. So doctors would not operate on them, the logic being that the already scarce medical resources required would effectively be wasted. These poor souls were kept as comfortable as possible with medication, but were basically left to perish so that stronger soldiers could be treated instead. Sounds kind of like an HMO. However, if a soldier was wounded in the arm or leg, their chances of survival were deemed higher, and they would get some attention from a physician. At that point, if you were in the north, the surgeon would wash out the wound with a sponge. In the south, where sponges ran out fast, they typically used a cloth. The doctor would next probe the wound with his finger, looking for bits of cloth, bone, or the bullet itself. If the bone was broken or a major blood vessel had been torn, the surgeon would usually recommend an amputation, the closest thing to a mascot the Civil War had. For Civil War surgeons, amputation was one of the most frequently performed surgical procedures. Historians estimate that over 60,000 amputations were carried out during the conflict. In fact, it was so common that the patients started calling the doctors sawbones. According to Star Trek, this nickname would endure well into the 23rd century. Patients would be given anesthetic in the form of chloroform, which is pretty effective, but there was a downside. If the dose wasn't measured correctly, the chloroform could cause fatal cardiac arrest. Such cases were rare, reportedly only accounting for 0.4% of the total lives lost during the war. Nonetheless, chloroform is not considered safe by modern medical standards and is no longer in use. Given these operations were being performed under battlefield conditions, they had to be done fast. An experienced surgeon, who often worked alone due to chronic understaffing, could remove a limb in 10 minutes. They presumably included their best times on their business cards. These doctors often worked all night, with piles of amputated limbs reaching 4 or 5 feet in some cases. That's 4 or 5 feet as in depth, not feet as in feet. Despite the extreme conditions, 75% of amputees survived. However, that still meant a quarter of amputee patients perished. All the decaying corpses and body parts often made the smell of putrefying flesh completely overwhelming, doubly so in hot weather. So, long story short, there's a reason Yankee Candle doesn't make a Gettysburg surgery scent. Not all of the surgeons were experienced. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Since medical standards were very different in those days, students were able to complete medical school much quicker. This meant that many of the battlefield surgeons were essentially job shadowing. In fact, of the roughly 11,000 Northern doctors, just 500 had performed surgery before. In the Confederacy, the numbers were even worse. Just 27 of their 3,000 doctors had surgical experience. And even if the doctor was experienced, there was a non-zero chance that they might have been drunk. Alcohol, like whiskey, was often used as an anesthetic, which meant there could be a lot of it lying around. Soldiers were known to report that some of the surgeons were drinking the whiskey and operating under the influence. The military took these accusations seriously, dismissing doctors who were found to be drunk on the job. The only person allowed to be drunk on the job during the Civil War was Ulysses S. Grant. Despite how well documented the era was, many myths about medical care during the war still persist to this day. For example, many movies would have you believe that amputations were carried out without the use of anesthesia, but as previously mentioned, that's not the case. In fact, anesthesia, first used in 1846, was common by the time of the Civil War, and there are over 80,000 recorded cases of its use. So why do so many believe it wasn't used? No one is certain. But at least one medical historian believes it may be because the anesthesia was so light, many soldiers assumed none was being used at all. Which, in fairness, sounds like the same thing as not using anesthesia. It is also widely believed that the treatments used in Civil War hospitals were substandard even for the time. However, other than treating malaria with quinine, pain with opiates, and vaccinating against smallpox, there were no specific general therapies. No one knew what was causing disease, or what those diseases were doing to the body. So the medical care the soldiers received was, in fact, the best available, even if it was kind of lame. As the casualties piled up, both the North and the South began to build general military hospitals, where soldiers could get a better class of treatment. Located mostly in bigger cities like Philadelphia, Knoxville, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, these hospitals tended to be well ventilated and heated. Good thing, too, because injured soldiers could be there for weeks or even months. Getting shot in the 19th century was like a Las Vegas residency. You're going to be stuck in the same building and high out of your mind for half the year. And whereas the field hospitals were held together by spit and polish, the general hospitals usually had it all, including kitchens, laundries, linen rooms, storerooms, chapels, and offices. Being much further from the front lines, general hospitals were much less chaotic. The staff spent most of their time cleaning, cooking, emptying bedpans, and administering medicines. And presumably, the doctors did not begin each amputation by starting a stopwatch.
And we're going to pause this story right here so we can tell you this video is sponsored by Saeli. When you love history as much as I do, you want to see it up close. So I took a trip to see the pyramids in Egypt. But the only part of my trip that made history was the insanely expensive roaming fees on my phone bill. So to make sure that never happens again, I got Saeli. Saeli is an eSIM app that can help you stay connected in more than 200 places around the world. What's an eSIM app? Well, it's like a SIM card, except digital. That means no more swapping physical SIMs. With Saeli, all you have to do is choose a data plan, install it on your phone, and you're good to go. Only unlike a regular SIM card, there are no expensive roaming fees. That's right, Saeli significantly reduces and sometimes even completely eliminates roaming charges by offering affordable eSIM plans for pretty much wherever you're headed. And if you're going to more than one place, you can get a regional or global eSIM plan that will save you even more money. You'll also save time skipping the line for a local eSIM card at the airport. And you won't even have to think about all those scammers selling fake SIM cards outside the airport. Saeli also has features that protect your privacy and reduce data usage. And all of Saeli's plans are compatible with both iOS and Android. To give it a test drive, go to saeli.com/weirdhistory or download the Saeli app and use code WEIRDHISTORY to get an exclusive 15% off Saeli eSIM data plans. Best of all, there's nothing to lose, because if it's not compatible with your phone, you get a full refund. Alright, now back to our regularly scheduled Weird History.
Living in ancient Greece and Rome wasn't as glamorous as the myths and legends would have us believe. A lack of central plumbing, bacteria-laden water supplies, and insufficient medical knowledge led to high mortality rates throughout antiquity and beyond. Today, heart disease, cancer, and old age are the leading causes of death. But back then, things were a little different. With a life expectancy of only 20 to 33 years, it's no surprise life was a bit uncertain during ancient times. So, today we're looking at the most common causes of death in ancient Greece and Rome. Movies about Greek and Roman times tend to focus on men having heroic adventures or gladiators being pitted against all odds in battle. But the reality of death in the ancient world affected women and children the most. The biggest killer of them all? Having a kid. Yeah, not only a killer to your social life, but also your life. Poor sanitation and a lack of knowledge about microorganisms often led to high infant mortality rates in ancient Greece and Rome. Medical practices were centered on having an experienced midwife, medicinal herbs, and making offerings or prayers to the gods. Very little written evidence regarding childbirth death rates survives from the period. Researchers estimate death rates from Greece and Rome at being comparable to those of 18th century rural England, where maternal mortality rates hovered around 2.5%. Unfortunately, surviving birth didn't necessarily guarantee a long life ahead. Even after successful childbirth, infants still suffered a high mortality rate. Historians estimate that only 75% of Roman children survived to the age of 10. To make matters worse, both Greek and Roman families gave their patriarchs the power to accept or reject a child after birth. That meant if a child was ill, weak, or suffered from a birth defect, a man in the family could determine their fate. This could lead to adoption, being sent into slavery, or being left to die from the cold. Even if accepted into the family, underdeveloped immune systems could spell doom for the unfortunate child. In the end, many infants still succumb to illnesses we can treat with modern medicine today. Infection and lack of sanitation may have been responsible for many deaths in Rome, but other diseases would also make their mark on the ancient civilization. Ample historic evidence suggests malaria may have been one of the deadliest killers in ancient Rome, especially during those long, hot summer months. Characterized by high fevers, shaking, chills, and a flu-like illness, malaria is a deadly and debilitating disease. It's transmitted by infected mosquitoes, who have a tendency to linger around stagnant water sources. Unfortunately, the Romans didn't understand the relationship between standing water, mosquitoes, and the deadly disease. Due to marshy conditions surrounding the city, several malaria epidemics broke out that helped contribute to the decimation of the city. By the start of the Dark Ages, Rome went from a bustling city to a small town surrounded by swampland. Plague outbreaks arrived in ancient Greece and Rome quickly, usually occurring during critical months of overcrowding in the streets. During the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides wrote of Athens being overcrowded with refugees and suffering the deaths of tens of thousands of inhabitants. No one, regardless of status, was spared by the plague. Casualties included everyone from commoners to a prominent statesman named Pericles. Plague pandemics ran amok during this period to disastrous results. During the time of Marcus Aurelius, the Antonine Plague, also known as the Plague of Galen, decimated Rome. Although it sounds like something from a mid-season Babylon 5 episode, it was largely regarded as one of Rome's first known pandemics, and it may have been caused by smallpox or measles. The plague is said to have killed 1/3 of the population in the regions of Rome, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, and Italy. Transmitted by soldiers returning from faraway military outposts, the plague may have also been responsible for the death of Marcus Aurelius himself. In the 6th century, a form of the bubonic plague took out as much as half of the Roman population, in what one might consider a macabre prequel to the medieval Black Death that occurred centuries later. But plagues weren't the only diseases plaguing the ancient Romans. It might be one of the great wonders of the ancient world, but the Roman Colosseum has nothing on the horrors of venereal disease. While it may not have had much impact on the mortality rates of ancient Greeks and Romans, it still caused major problems in a world where poor sanitation, a lack of contraception, and misunderstanding of microorganisms all converged to allow its wanton spread. The word gonorrhea actually derives from the ancient Greek terms for seed and flow, which suggests they may have misunderstood the disease entirely. The debate over syphilis and how it originated has been going on for centuries. Researchers first thought the travelers to the New World brought the disease back with them. But in true historical fashion, it turns out to have been described by Hippocrates' writings, and evidence of the disease appeared in the skeletons from Pompeii. This just goes to show it's been around a long time, and definitely existed in Europe well before the discovery of the Americas by Europeans. Just like every game of Oregon Trail you've ever played, the likelihood of someone getting cholera or dysentery was pretty high. Due to its size, density, and social structure, ancient Rome was an ideal breeding ground for infectious diseases. One of them, the bacterial nightmare known as cholera, was closely tied to life and death in Rome. so much so that its name is derived from the Latin phrase bilious disease. While cholera is commonly spread through contaminated drinking water, ancient Rome provided ample other opportunities for the disease to thrive. The poor lacked a freshwater supply, and much like today, poor hygiene habits abounded in public toilets everywhere. Shared public baths, located conveniently adjacent to those same shared public toilets, certainly didn't help. As for the toilets themselves, they were basically just dark rooms with a bunch of holes in the ground. Just like today's big box stores, they didn't have any dividers, lacked cleanliness, and didn't have any toilet paper. Instead, the population used a shared tool called a xylospongium, which was basically just a sponge on a stick. After a thorough cleaning, the xylospongium was cleaned in water with salt and vinegar, which ended up facilitating the spread of bacteria-borne disease. Of course, if it wasn't disease taking someone out, a battle might do it instead. War is common to any civilization's history. Ancient historians did a pretty good job of keeping track of casualties associated with various wars in ancient Rome. The writings of Livy and Appian tell of over 100,000 soldier deaths between 201 and 151 BCE. The three Punic Wars were fought between Carthage and Rome over expansions of their respective empires. The First Punic War was largely a dispute between the Empire of Carthage and Rome in a new hope to gain the island of Sicily. The empire struck back in 218 when Hannibal crossed the Alps to attack Rome. The deadly Battle of Cannae during the Second Punic War in 216 claimed the lives of over 70,000 Romans at the hands of Carthage forces. The Third Punic War saw Rome laying siege to Carthage and bringing an end to the wars in 146. Many other battles resulted in countless lives lost as the empire began to wane. In ancient Greece, the specter of war wasn't as prevalent, but it did strike with deadly ferocity whenever it reared its ugly head. Wars between city-states like Athens and Sparta rocked the ancient world. Other invasions took their toll as well. When the Persian Empire invaded Greece, it significantly affected male mortality rates and caused trouble throughout the land. Who doesn't enjoy a little drink now and then? The ancient Greeks and Romans certainly did. Drinking wine became a widespread practice over time, eventually taking on religious overtones. But by the 1st century BCE, it became the drink of choice for Romans everywhere. Everyone from the working class to the emperor indulged in wine drinking, with the average person consuming about 100 gallons of the stuff each year. That is a lot of wine. In Greek society, they encouraged moderation and temperance when it came to wine. But in Rome, things were a little different, with the cult of Bacchus. The Bacchanalia were popular and well organized throughout Rome. As a ritualistic, covert practice, it involved drunken depravity, promiscuity, aggression, and even death. The government attempted to outlaw and suppress such practices, banning and putting the Bacchanalia under the Senate's control in 186 BCE. Heavy drinking had much the same effect on people as it does today, and an increase in crime and violence. If there was one thing that was prevalent in ancient Rome, it was crime and violence. Wars were often brutal enough, but entertainment often involved displays of violence and bloodshed through the infamous Colosseum. Society was also divided by class, race, and religion, making conflict inevitable. Robbery, street crime, alcohol-related aggression, and assault were common and often deadly. Perhaps the most devastating killer of ancient Greeks and Romans is one villain we're still battling today: cancer. The word actually originated from the work of the Greek physician Hippocrates. When he noticed ulcers and non-ulcer-forming lesions, he described them as karkinos and karkinoma. In Greek, these words refer to crabs. Hippocrates thought crabs resembled tumors due to their finger-like projections. The Roman physician Celsus translated these Greek terms to cancer, which was the Latin word for crab. The Greek physician Galen used the word onkos to describe the swelling, which later became the basis of the word oncologist, currently used to describe modern cancer specialists. Etymology aside, cancer was just as deadly and pervasive during ancient times as it is now. It was often diagnosed and described, but evidence suggests it wasn't nearly as common as it is today. This is probably because people didn't live as long, but it could also be due to the lack of carcinogens in the air that the industrial age would eventually bring. But that's a story for another time. Over the last few years, we all got to experience an infectious disease outbreak as COVID-19 and its many Kang-like variants spread around the globe. But historically speaking, epidemics, and even pandemics, are not all that uncommon. Since the moment we existed on Earth, humans have constantly been getting each other sick. So, today we're looking back at the most significant infectious diseases of every century. Basic familiarity with leprosy, though not by name, goes all the way back to the ancient world. The Bible mentions a number of skin disorders that may have included leprosy, and in the New Testament, Jesus famously heals some of the afflicted rather than shunning them. The Hindu Vedas, dating all the way back to 2000 BCE, mention skin diseases that likely include leprosy. And many historians also believe that ancient Greek and Roman references to elephantitis actually refer to patients with leprosy symptoms. The widely feared illness became associated with gruesome, disfiguring symptoms. But at its core, it's a bacterial infection that damages the nerves, respiratory tract, skin, and eyes. Because the nerve damage can result in an inability to feel pain in your extremities, it could lead to repeated infections or even removal of the limbs. Leprosy really needs a better publicist. Prolonged exposure is required for the bacteria to jump between humans. Though if the sick person is coughing or leaking a lot of fluid from their nose, that can help contribute. This also made it more common in low-income areas, where people lived closer together in less hygienic environments. By the 10th century in Europe, leprosy was among the most pressing public health issues. In the early Middle Ages, the Roman Church began setting aside funds for leper colonies and clinics, separating patients from the general population so they could be looked after, often by monastic orders. In present-day Belgium alone, it's believed there were up to 800 such clinics around the First Crusades. There wasn't much available in the way of actual medical treatment for these unfortunate patients. The main goal was not so much curing their disease as quarantining the sick to prevent any wider spread. Today, leprosy is typically treated with antibiotics. So if anyone invented a time machine, now would be a good time to give it to a doctor. Or we could just let the antibiotics drive themselves. Influenza was also a serious concern in medieval times, though we can't be fully certain that every outbreak referred to as the flu at the time actually was. Many infections with a similar symptom profile were likely floating through the air, and medieval doctors didn't necessarily associate respiratory illness with the flu. Misdiagnoses were extremely likely. That being said, the first confidently the flu pandemic started around the year 1510 in East Asia, before spreading to North Africa and Europe. Following this major outbreak, seasonal influenza occurred, with additional pandemics in 1557 and 1580. By the close of the 16th century, the disease was far better understood, but at the cost of mass infection and death. In fact, it's estimated that nearly everyone in the impacted area was infected, with a death rate of around 1%. Despite medical advances in understanding the disease, flu outbreaks remained a routine problem throughout modern European history. In 1729, an influenza outbreak spread rapidly across Europe, reached pandemic proportions within 6 months, and ultimately made it to the Americas. An even larger-scale influenza outbreak happened in 1781, which is believed to have started in China before spreading around the world. This one claimed tens of millions of lives and was particularly devastating to youth populations. The bubonic plague outbreak, commonly known as the Black Plague or the Black Death, swept across Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa starting around 1346. And that's not just a spooky nickname. It really was among the most fatal pandemics in recorded human history, causing an estimated 75 to 200 million deaths. That's about 30 to 60% of the entire European population at the time, completely removed, like a bad tattoo. For a long time, historians believe that the plague reached Europe and spread so quickly due to the Mongol conquests of the 14th century. But there's ample evidence backing up alternate theories. For example, fleas traveling on rats living on Genoese ships may have carried the illness around the Mediterranean, including North Africa and throughout the Italian peninsula. That's a nesting doll we don't want to play with. Plague remained an ongoing concern for Europeans for several hundred years. The final major outbreak occurred in London in 1665, and offed an estimated 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city's entire population, in just 18 months. London in this period was both dirty and crowded, making it an ideal breeding ground for plague bacterium. Poorer parts of the city were densely overpopulated, filled with crowded tenement buildings, and a sanitation system consisting of open drains flowing through the city streets. Just a lot of uncovered poop rivers. So think about that the next time you complain about English weather or weird breakfasts. It could always be worse. Let's switch gears to syphilis, which is something you never want to hear from your general practitioner. This illness is also caused by a bacteria and typically gets spread during sexual contact. The infection progresses in 4 stages, starting with sores on the skin, followed by a rash and potential mouth sores, and then a latent period without new symptoms, which can last for several years, during which time patients remain symptom-free but can be as infectious as a tasty groove. But then, the final stage involves non-cancerous growths around the body, plus neurological and heart symptoms which can include dementia, seizures, and severe depression. The earliest historical report about a syphilis outbreak occurred during France's invasion of Naples, Italy, in 1494. For a time, the illness was known as the French disease because of this connection. The term syphilis didn't arise until its use by Italian physician and poet Girolamo Fracastoro in 1530. Sacre bleu! In a fortunate stroke of luck, syphilis was the first major new disease to be recognized and diagnosed following the development of the printing press. News about the disease, how to detect it, and how to avoid it spread far more quickly because of this innovative leap in mass communication. Think of these as history's first "the more you know" PSAs. Historians still don't exactly know how syphilis came to Europe. Some argue it had already existed but just been misdiagnosed as other illnesses. Syphilis was sometimes referred to as the Great Imitator because its symptoms can so readily resemble other illnesses, like a vaudevillian impressionist. Others theorize that syphilis actually started in the New World and came back to Europe along with Christopher Columbus's crew. This vast transfer between Old and New Worlds became known as the Columbian Exchange. While syphilis potentially spread from Caribbean populations to Europe, illnesses passing from European travelers to American natives were far deadlier. A 1493 outbreak of the swine influenza devastated the Taino population in the Caribbean. Measles, whooping cough, chickenpox, typhus, and malaria were also concerns. But by far the most devastating European illness to spread through the Americas was smallpox. An estimated 40% of the population of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan succumbed to smallpox in 1520 during the invasion of conquistador Hernán Cortés. Hey, we did an entire episode about that guy. Spoiler, he was not a chill dude. In general, disease wiped out far more Native Americans than war. Around 80 to 95% of the total Native American population perished in epidemics within the first 150 years after Columbus arrived in 1492. They tend to leave that part out of the Ocean Blue rhyme. Cholera became a global concern during the 19th century, but it's still unclear whether the world ever suffered a technical cholera pandemic. What is clear is, throughout the 1800s, at least 5 large-scale outbreaks occurred that caused the loss of around 1 million human lives. The first known outbreak hit between 1817 and 1823, starting around India's Ganges River. It spread quickly across the Indian subcontinent, then to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and ultimately Europe. The years 1852 to 1859 saw the most concentrated cholera deaths of the century. It was this outbreak, specifically the London arrival of cholera in 1853, that inspired English physician John Snow to investigate the disease, like some sort of germ detective. At the time, most experts believed that illnesses like cholera were caused by pollutants in the air, but Snow rejected this hypothesis. He spoke with locals around Soho and was ultimately able to trace infections to a single public water pump on Broad Street. The germ theory of disease had not yet been established, so Snow didn't understand specifically how the illness was passing from the pump to the people who used it. He just knew the water was no good for anyone. But his work still led the city to disable the pump, which was widely credited with ending the outbreak. Today, Snow is considered the father of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread. Unlike John Snow, looks like this Snow did know something. During the COVID pandemic, we all heard a lot about the Spanish flu of the early 20th century. Estimated to be the most devastating pandemic in human history, the Spanish flu took out between 20 and 50 million people in the Americas and Europe between 1918 and 1920. That's 4 times more casualties than the entirety of World War I, which are pretty good numbers for a disease. Despite its name, it's unlikely the Spanish flu actually started in Spain. Because the outbreak began toward the end of World War I, news about the illness spread slowly in fighting countries. Local press would often simply avoid negative news topics for fear of impacting morale. But in neutral Spain, the outbreak was more widely reported, leading to the false impression of the disease's origin. It's considered more likely by contemporary researchers that the Spanish flu actually started in China, potentially as an avian flu that passed into humans. A number of factors, including anomalous climate patterns and overcrowded hospitals, allowed the disease to spread more quickly. Additionally, while many influenza outbreaks disproportionately impacted children and the elderly, the Spanish flu had a particularly devastating effect on young adults. Which brings us to the present day. Besides COVID, a number of other infectious diseases remain a significant concern. The list includes Ebola, SARS, and even tuberculosis, though that particular illness has been curable and preventable for many years. Contemporary people have also been struggling with the onset of DoorDash-itis, an affliction that causes you to spend too much money ordering out.
The 1970s were a time of scientific innovation. NASA launched Voyager 1. Intel launched the world's first general microprocessor, and Honda launched the Civic. So it didn't strike many as cause for skepticism when some sciencey seeming types started talking up the power of biorhythms. And if you're wondering what those are, well, today we're taking a look at the strange life algorithm that ruled the 70s. All right, rhythm section, time to find out if this theory is rushing or dragging. What do we mean when we say biorhythms? Well, let's start with what we don't mean. Stay with us now. Biorhythms are not, as the root words might suggest, biological rhythms. The most well-known example you might have heard of being circadian rhythms. These kinds of rhythms are actual biological processes, things that happen within our bodies, that occur over and over. So, for example, humans have a diurnal circadian biological rhythm, which means we're active during the daytime and sleep at night over and over. Got it? Good, because again, that isn't what biorhythms are. Biorhythm comes from the Greek root words bios, which means life, and rhythmos, which means a regularly occurring movement or motion. That's right, it's all Greek to me is not just a corny joke. Anyway, biorhythm theory posits that human lives are influenced by repeating cycles in various spheres of existence, and these cycles can be explicitly plotted and tracked. There is a 23-day physical cycle, a 28-day emotional cycle, and a 33-day intellectual cycle. And if you're a bicycle courier who wakes up from a coma to find that society has been destroyed by a zombie-making rage virus, that's the 28 days later cycle. Okay, technically they're not zombies, but you get the idea. Biorhythm theory suggests our hormones, psychology, and physiology all move like a sine wave. These cycles ostensibly start from a person's birth, and their rhythms are steady from the jump too. So if you put these rhythms on a chart, you can calculate exactly when your prowess in each ability will be at its peak or its valley. And we mean calculate literally. This next part might remind you of that nightmare where you have to take a calculus test and didn't study, but there are constant mathematical formulas you can use to deduce your own biorhythmic cycle. Now brace yourself, because here comes the math. Imagine the variable t as the number of days since your birth. Now, to determine your physical cycle, take the sine of 2 pi t divided by 23. For emotions, replace 23 with 28. And for intellect, that last number becomes 33. Put these results on a graph, and you can allegedly start to see when you peak. That is, when your number on one of these days is at plus 100%. You can also tell when you crash, when your number is at minus 100%. And you can tell when you're totally average, which is when the number is at 0%. And while this next bit isn't really part of a biorhythm theory, we think doing stuff on 69% days would be pretty funny. 69! Nice. The concept of biorhythms didn't just emerge organically from nothing. That would be too, well, biological. Instead, we have a few people to thank for developing these ideas. German otolaryngologist Wilhelm Fliess, who was a homie of Sigmund Freud, is considered the father of biorhythm theory. While diagnosing his many patients with various maladies of the ear, nose, and throat, Dr. Fliess began organizing research that supported his theory that humans fell into 23 and 28-day rhythmic cycles. In particular, he found that the arrival of certain illnesses in children coincided with these rhythms, and he believed that was no coincidence. Dr. Fliess published many of these ideas in the 1906 book Der Ablauf des Lebens, or The Course of Life. though his peers and critics mostly found the book confusing and bordering on pseudoscience. Fleece's other fascinations included the idea of inherited traits and their social meanings. So, for example, left-handed people being more artistic, and the idea that everyone is a little bit bisexual. So if you're annoyed with your friend who has a long-term boyfriend but insists she's bi, we're sorry to inform you that Dr. Fleece agrees with her. Other figures in the biorhythm movement include University of Vienna psychology professor Hermann Swoboda, whose independent research came to a similar 30-ish day period conclusion. He published his work after Fleece, which intrigued University of Innsbruck engineering professor Alfred Teltscher. Teltscher began observing his students and felt that their academic performances coincided with a 33-day period, effectively inventing the mental biorhythmic period. Absolutely mental, isn't it? Sorry, no more accents, we promise. Anyhow, if you search the internet, you'll also see a bunch of sources that claim the first academic book on the subject of biorhythms was 1923's Rhythm, Life, and Creation by the Estonian geneticist Nikolai Parna. But as far as we can tell, Parna wasn't actually writing about Fleece's biorhythms. He was referring to biological rhythms, which he called chronobiology. If you're starting to get confused, we can't blame you, because all these vaguely similar but slightly different terms are confusing, and predictably, that confusion has benefited more than a few folks who rely on it to distract people from the lack of evidence at the core of some of their more questionable claims. And now we're going to take you through the news, culture, sports, entertainment, and all that was weird in 1970, because this is Timeline. Oh, wait, wrong weird history video. But still, we are going to have to time travel back to the 1970s, a time of beloved popular movies like Jaws, Star Wars, and Superman. Beloved popular presidents like Nixon, Ford, and Carter, and most importantly of all, the New Age movement. But what constitutes New Age isn't exactly easy to define. According to religious scholar Darren Kemp, participants in the New Age movement call it a revolutionary period of history dictated by the stars. Christians and other mainstream religious types call it a cult, and psychologists call it a form of narcissism. But there is one thing all of them would probably agree on, which is, when discussing the New Age, you must bump Yanni and you must bump Enya. For our purposes, we can hastily define the New Age as a collection of spiritual and humanistic beliefs derived from sources as varied as physician Franz Mesmer, from whom we get mesmerism, and the 1960s counterculture movement, from whom we got Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is not quite as good as Yanni. This movement, nooks, crannies, and all, proved to be a perfect fermenter of biorhythm theory. Capitalizing on this was Bernard Gittleson, a businessman who used to be the president of a PR firm before he was alleged to have bribed a city official for a parking meter contract. If that sounds like the kind of guy you trust with scientific theories, then we recommend you check out his books, Biorhythm, A Personal Science, and Biorhythm Charts of the Famous and Infamous, both of which were published when he pivoted from PR to NA, which we're now saying stands for New Age. Gittleson, ever the businessman, also founded a company called Biorhythm Computers Incorporated, which sold customers biorhythm calculators and charts so they too could figure out their cycles and when to act in accordance with them. He even published a book called Biorhythm Sports Forecasting that taught people, and we swear we're not making this up, how to predict and bet on sports games using the lessons of biorhythms. Alas, it didn't work, though we do have to give him credit for coming up with the most imaginative how-to-win-at-gambling method prior to the release of Back to the Future Part 2. Even though Gittleson's claims were largely proven false, they helped spur the popularity of biorhythm theory. Also helping was George S. Tommen, whose book, Is This Your Day? How Biorhythm Helps You Determine Your Life Cycles, was so influential that world-renowned heart surgeon Dr. Christian Barnard, literally the guy who performed the world's first human-to-human heart transplant operation, wouldn't operate on patients until he charted out their biorhythms to see if they could handle it. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, but only if that apple falls into the negative percentile of a biorhythm chart, apparently. At his peak, Tommen would regularly appear on radio and television talk shows to discuss his theories, ensuring that people across the United States could hear them and be swayed. So what were Tommen's medical bona fides to deserve this influence? Well, he was a championship skier, and then he worked in banking, importing, the movie business, and even fly fishing. And if all that added up doesn't make you a doctor, what the heck kind of world do we even live in? Whatever the case, it worked. And biorhythm theory became so popular that arcades and amusement parks started offering patrons a chance to stick a few coins into a machine that printed out biorhythm charts after entering your birth date. Sure, those machines are likely just as accurate as the machines that tell you whether you're hot stuff after squeezing a lever for 5 seconds. But what do you expect from a medical exam you bought for 25 cents from a machine at a carnival? As if that wasn't enough, there were also biorhythm programs made for the then-developing personal computer. And beyond Gitelson's calculators, well-known companies like Casio built and sold their own devices for folks to chart their cycles. Were they cool? Sure, but could you spell a funny word by typing numbers like 8008135 on them? Checkmate, biorhythm calculators. Boobies. As for the modern day, well, there are still plenty of online biorhythm calculators and apps available on your phone right now, proving there are many folks still interested in the theory and what it can do for them. And all of this is totally great and wonderful, except for one small thing. None of it is real. Sorry, biorhythm myths, you're about to get busted. If you're the kind of person who always skips right to the TLDR summary, then straight up, there is not a single shred of scientific evidence to support biorhythm theory. If you like a fuller explanation, then when it comes to biorhythms, it's best to look at them as an entertaining way to think about life on par with astrology or tarot readings. But it cannot and should not be a legitimate method for plotting out your life. And with all due respect to Dr. Christiane Barnard, they definitely shouldn't play any role in determining anything even remotely related to heart surgery. But don't take our word for it. In 1998, researcher Terence Hines published a paper in the Psychological Reports journal called Comprehensive Review of Biorhythm Theory. His comprehensive review was basically, nah bro. More formally, after surveying 134 studies on the subject, Hines deduced that biorhythm researchers were propagating null hypotheses, which means that there is fundamentally no effect on the subjects that cannot be explained by coincidence. As for the ones that had any kind of positive conclusion, well, they were riddled with methodological or statistical errors, which made said conclusions void. And you thought you wouldn't use the scientific method past high school chemistry. Additionally, in his 1997 book Numerology, or What Pythagoras Wrought, mathematician Underwood Dudley wrote of an example showing biorhythm theory to be nothing more than the culmination of logical fallacies. Dudley described a magician who gave a spectator her biorhythm chart, saying it would predict key elements of her life. Later, she told the magician just how accurate the chart was. Just one problem. The magician purposefully gave the woman a biorhythm chart for the wrong birth date. When he copped to this, she asked for another one, which he gave her, and she later said this one was even more accurate. And well, you don't have to be M. Night Shyamalan to know this chart was also for the wrong birth date. The point is, the human mind is a very powerful and very suggestible thing. It makes psychological sense that when someone predisposed to believe in something is told those beliefs are true, they will move through life in a way that makes those things true. Call it confirmation bias, call it a self-fulfilling prophecy, just don't call it proof that biorhythm charts are real. Still, there are plenty of people, New Age or otherwise, who believe in biorhythm theory, despite the empirical evidence debunking it. As a result, this theory is categorized by most as pseudoscience, the kind of belief or practice that claims scientific veracity despite not being provable by the scientific method nor accepted by the scientific community at large. In other words, biorhythm theory is about as helpful to your life as snake oil is to your bald spot. And if you still believe in it, well, we've got a bridge we'd like to sell you, just as soon as it lines up with our chart.
In the 1900s, psychiatric hospitals were known as lunatic asylums or insane asylums, and officials there would lock patients up against their will, despite having few ideas about how to properly treat their problems. In 1900, patients at psychiatric hospitals in the United States faced inhumane treatment that today would be regarded as nothing short of torture. So, today we're going to take a look at what it was like to be a patient in a U.S. mental hospital in the year 1900. In the early days of psychiatric hospitals, not everyone chose to enter one of their own free will. In fact, up until the 1960s, the majority of patients in the U.S. mental health facilities were admitted involuntarily. By contrast, about 71% of people in psychiatric institutions today are there voluntarily. The problem wasn't just with medicine, it also had a lot to do with the laws that allowed families to commit their relatives with little to no supporting evidence. In 1860, for example, based on an Illinois law, Elizabeth Packard landed in an asylum for 3 years for no reason other than that she practiced a different religion from her husband. Parents also routinely committed their children to mental institutions for questionable reasons. In 1883, Henry Fraser was sent to an asylum in New Orleans because his mother called him uncontrollable, saying that he played with himself to complete exhaustion. Exacerbating the problem were perverse financial incentives for the hospitals themselves. That is, families could literally just purchase confinement for relatives they didn't want to deal with. I can see that temptation. And patients might stay in psychiatric institutions for extended periods. By 1904, only 27.8% of asylum patients in the U.S. had been institutionalized for a year or less. The vast majority were long-term cases. Given how awful the care was, some people with mental health issues tried to hide their condition to avoid being sent to an asylum. And it's hard to blame them. In 1887, journalist Nellie Bly agreed to go undercover in a mental asylum to record the conditions inside. She reported horrific treatment from doctors, including hair pulling and solitary confinement. Bly also decried the way patients were treated like prisoners. She wrote of how when she couldn't sleep, she would lay in bed imagining how horrible it would be if a fire broke out in the institution. Bly had noticed that every door in the building was locked separately, and the windows were all heavily barred, meaning that escape was close to impossible. A doctor had told her that in one building alone there were some 300 women locked 10 to a room, and it was impossible to get out unless the doors were manually unlocked. By the early 20th century, many mental hospitals routinely tested patients for syphilis. We now know syphilis would remain incurable until the advent of antibiotics. But in 1900, at the Oregon State Hospital, doctors used what was called malarial treatment for people newly infected with the disease. Doctors who used the treatment, first advocated by Dr. Julius Wagner Jauregg, intentionally injected malaria germs into a patient's bloodstream based on the theory that malarial fever could kill syphilis. Wagner Jauregg's research showed that approximately half of these patients saw a reduction in syphilis symptoms after the malaria infection, which sounds pretty promising. However, the same research showed that at least 15% died from the treatment, which is less promising, although it didn't stop them from using it. The earliest treatments for mental illness were, to put it mildly, absolutely brutal. In the early 19th century, asylums in England used a wheel to spin patients at high speed. Other treatments, still used at the end of the 19th century, included harnessing patients and swinging them, or branding a patient with hot irons in an attempt to bring them to their senses. You're probably thinking that eventual improvements in medical technology meant better treatment, but that was far from the case. It usually just meant new forms of torture. By the 1930s, doctors began to experiment with new, troubling methods of treating mental illness, which included lobotomies and electroshock therapy. Patients soon learned the only way to get out of the insane asylum was to fake it. "You do just what the doctor says if you want to get out of here," one patient said. Of course, while faking it might have gotten you out, it didn't cure you. The same patient we just quoted later died by their own hand. Mental hospitals around 1900 didn't just treat adults, they also admitted children. Between 1854 and 1900, the Worcester County Asylum screened hundreds of children who were 16 or younger to determine whether they needed treatment. The asylum admitted nearly 200 children, recording their violent tendencies and risk of suicide. One study found a high death rate among the children, who rarely saw their families after being admitted. This isn't too surprising, given that doctors treated the children in the same way as their adult patients, making no allowances for their young age. Inside the mental hospital, patients slept in single rooms or dormitories. Nellie Bly described women sleeping 10 to a room, with locked doors and bars on the windows. And at the Oregon State Hospital, we know that sleeping rooms were 7 by 14 feet. The Morning Oregonian reported in 1883 that the hospital contained modern technology, including dumbwaiters that opened and closed as they traveled, to prevent patients from escaping. Ironically, late 19th century reforms had proposed treating mental illness with rest, beautiful buildings, and manicured grounds, resulting in majestic architecture on the outside of mental hospitals. It was all so nice, the facilities sometimes even attracted asylum tourists. However, despite the tranquil outsides, the conditions inside the hospital still reflected the idea that patients should be treated as prisoners. In 1900, the lousy treatment at psychiatric hospitals wasn't solely reserved for long-term residents. In fact, newly admitted patients were often immediately subjected to dehumanizing tests. At the Oregon State Hospital, for example, patients had to empty their pockets and strip for a bath. After a medical examination, patients underwent blood and syphilis tests. Finally, they might be shown to a room with bars on the windows and left alone. Women's institutions sometimes used different procedures. According to Nellie Bly, her examination to fully determine if she was mentally ill included a physical assessment, where a doctor accused her of taking drugs. You'd think a top priority for a psychiatric facility would be to make sure everyone could easily tell the difference between doctors and patients, but that wasn't always the case. At the Oregon State Hospital, at least, the standard white outfits could actually be confusing. According to one patient, neither patients nor staff wore uniforms. The first person this patient saw was a man in a white apron. He thought that person was an attendant, and he asked him a question. But later he learned that that man in the apron was also a patient, and the two were in the same ward. Awkward. During his involuntary commitment, the patient found himself perpetually confused, eventually concluding, usually the attendants are a little better dressed than the patients. At St. Elizabeth's, also known as the Government Hospital for the Insane, Dr. Harry Hummer promoted eggs as an important part of the diet for sick patients, recording that 125 patients went through 17 dozen eggs every day. Patients with epilepsy, meanwhile, received a special diet. According to Hummer, these patients were not allowed to have anything that doctors thought would upset them, which included foods like corned beef or cabbage, and so-called heavy indigestible foods. Nellie Bly described a meal consisting of tea, a single piece of bread, rancid butter, and 5 prunes. After a 10-day undercover visit in Bellevue Hospital, Bly reported, "The eating was one of the most horrible things." However, conditions could vary, and patients at another asylum reported the dining room felt more like a restaurant or hotel dining room. Patients sat together while other patients served them. Some institutions also grew their own food on the grounds, with patients working in the field to theoretically improve their mental health, which also saved money for the institution. State mental hospitals often housed multiple patients in barracks-like conditions that were significantly less than pleasant. In the nights before patient Taylor Benjamin, aka John the Baptist, died at the New Orleans City Insane Asylum in 1893, he reportedly slept very little, if any, at night, and was constantly screaming. One patient at the Oregon State Hospital also reported a complete lack of privacy. When he was resting in his room on his first day, another patient wandered in to tuck in the sheets. He was followed by 2 other patients who simply stared at the new arrival without talking. Room service. Bellevue Hospital in New York featured similar conditions. Nellie Bly reported about a crying woman who begged for death nearly the entire night. Another woman repeatedly yelled, "Murder." That's a tough environment to work on your mental health. Reformers in the 19th century encouraged states to build insane asylums. The effort was successful, and by the 1870s, most states had built at least one asylum, using tax dollars to treat those labeled insane. The Oregon State Hospital opened in 1883, and by 1936, the state had expanded the facilities to 2 additional buildings. At the time, the institution treated 2,400 patients. Reformers also argued that mental illnesses could be treated by rest and recuperation, which drove the creation of peaceful, manicured estates to treat patients. These often included gardens and lawns where patients could walk, and architecturally beautiful structures. Asylum tourism became a popular pursuit by the late 19th century. Guidebooks even recommended visits to asylums, including the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane, which, according to one guide, had one of the most extensive and beautiful views of any in the vicinity of the city. Doctors believed many different conditions could cause insanity, and sometimes committing patients to insane asylums was their only option. Records from the New Orleans City Insane Asylum in the late 1800s, for example, included notes from doctors that listed some of the reasons they might commit a patient. A man named Frank Camba was committed because malarial fevers had left him deranged. One William Byrne was institutionalized after he fell from a horse and landed on his head, which doctors said caused a softening of the brain. Henry Schreiber's diagnosis was congenital idiocy, and doctors wrote he had been an idiot from birth. And in the case of Jane D. Passay, who apparently drank too much whiskey, doctors concluded the cause of her insanity is chronic alcoholism. Good times. The first half of the 20th century brought repeated outbreaks of poliomyelitis, more commonly known as polio. It paralyzed tens of thousands worldwide and was highly prevalent in children. No cure existed, so the only real hope was for a vaccine. By the end of the 20th century, instances of the disease had declined exponentially. Today, the story of how the vaccine was developed, tested, and distributed can offer numerous insights into how pandemics may be combated. Today, we're going to take a look at what happened after the polio vaccine was developed. The scientific community had been working to understand the causes of polio for some time, and several attempts were made at creating a vaccine. Cases of polio in the United States finally peaked in 1952, when 60,000 children were infected, 3,000 died, and thousands more were paralyzed. That same year, Dr. Jonas Salk conducted the first successful human trials of a vaccine he and his team had developed by building on the work of previous scientists. In 1953, Salk showed the vaccine to his colleagues, and in a nationwide address made on the CBS radio network on March 26, 1953, Salk cautiously announced his results to the world. The scientist reported that the amount of antibody introduced by vaccination compares favorably with that which develops after natural infection. Salk stated that the results gave cause for optimism, but warned that the objective had not yet been accomplished. Shortly after the announcement, Salk demonstrated his confidence in the vaccine by administering it to himself, his wife, and their children. And, spoiler alert, they were all good. After Salk informed the Immunization Committee of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or NFIP, of his results, calls were made for field trials. A methodology which involved one observed control trial and a separate placebo-controlled trial was agreed upon, and groups from the United States, Canada, and Finland were selected for participation. More than 1 million first, second, and third graders were given the vaccine for the observed control trial, and another 750,000 were involved in the placebo-controlled trial. Overall, approximately 1.8 million children were involved. The first to receive the vaccine injection as part of the trial was a boy named Randall Kerr from McLean, Virginia, who enthusiastically proclaimed, "I could hardly feel it." Salk's research, which was carried out at the University of Pittsburgh, was funded by the NFIP. Founded by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938, the organization aimed to bring together researchers, educators, and volunteers to combat polio, which FDR himself had contracted at the age of 39. The first call for donations went out over the radio in January of 1938, when comedian Eddie Cantor told the public that the March of Dimes will enable all persons, even the children, to show our president that they are with him in this battle against this disease. He added, nearly everyone can send in a dime, or several dimes. It worked, and the White House quickly received nearly 2.7 million dimes. The program eventually paid for trials that took place in 211 countries and 44 states at a cost of nearly $8 million. It was so successful, in 1979, the NFIP would formally adopt the name March of Dimes. In 1955, the NFIP released the results of the trials, which showed that Salk's vaccine was 80 to 90% effective. Salk, for his part, didn't deny that the vaccine wasn't perfect, but he did insist that work to improve it was continuing. He held out hope that further research would lead to a 100% effectiveness rate against paralysis. Future improvements notwithstanding, the trials convinced the government to license the vaccine to several American pharmaceutical companies. And during the spring of 1955, nearly 5 million children across the U.S. received an inoculation. During an interview with legendary newsman Edward R. Murrow, Salk was asked about whether he had patented the vaccine. The scientist famously responded with a question of his own, asking, "Could you patent the sun?" While the NFIP did explore the idea of patenting the vaccine, they eventually concluded they didn't meet the requirements. Salk himself never sought a patent, which brought him great praise for what has widely been viewed as a selfless act of philanthropy. In 1955, 5 separate labs from across the United States made over 4 million doses of the vaccine. But despite this incredible action, there were still newly reported cases of paralytic polio, and scientists were getting concerned. An investigation showed that many of the new cases had appeared in people who received a vaccination from a manufacturer called Cutter Laboratories. And in May of 1955, Surgeon General Leonard Scheel suspended all vaccinations in the U.S. While vaccines made by Cutter were removed from the market, approximately 400,000 children had already been given the faulty doses. Of those, 250 developed polio, which was then spread to as many as 220,000 other people. At least 10 died. The incident led the National Institutes of Health and Public Health Services to issue safety and testing standards for the vaccine later the same year. Vaccinations resumed in the fall of 1955, but the faulty Cutter Labs vaccines had left the public skeptical of Salk's formula. It was at about this time that people turned to the work of Dr. Albert Sabin. Sabin had created an oral vaccine that used an attenuated but live strain of polio, whereas Salk's injected vaccine used a killed virus. While the NFIP financed Sabin's early research, they wouldn't support large field trials in the United States, so the doctor looked elsewhere. In 1957, the Soviet Union granted Sabin permission to conduct his field trials. Over the next 2 years, 4.5 million people in the Soviet Union, as well as Malaya, Mexico, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, would take his oral vaccine. The trial showed Sabin's vaccine was safe and effective. Once the news got out, medical professionals around the world began to debate the pros and cons of Salk's injected vaccine versus Sabin's oral vaccine. Once the vaccine was widely available, nations around the globe began implementing their own vaccination programs. The United Kingdom initiated their program in 1956 by offering the injected vaccine to all children under 10 years of age. Over time, more and more people became eligible, and by 1962, after switching to the oral vaccine, the UK had vaccinated most people under the age of 26. Vaccinations began in Canada and Denmark in 1955. Sweden and the Netherlands got started in 1957, and West Germany, who had initially tried a natural immunity approach, began the following year. By the end of the 50s, over 90 countries were vaccinating their citizenry. Starting with the introduction of the Salk vaccine in the 1950s, the number of polio cases in the United States declined consistently. By the 1960s, instances of the disease numbered in the hundreds, and by the 1970s, they were in double digits. Studies indicated that many of these later cases arose in individuals who hadn't been vaccinated or hadn't completed their vaccination. In 1979, the United States saw its last cases of wild poliovirus, which presented in certain under-vaccinated religious communities. Once these cases were dealt with, the U.S. declared itself free of polio. While the disease has occasionally been brought into the country through international travel, this declaration has proven mostly correct. The United States is not the only country to have eliminated polio thanks to large-scale immunization programs. The UK saw its last naturally occurring cases of the disease in 1984, and Canada declared victory in 1994. Eradicating polio worldwide was a noble goal, but it wasn't entirely clear it could actually be done. Many countries around the world were at war, which made mass vaccination difficult, if not impossible. To help accomplish the goal, various international aid agencies worked to broker what they called Days of Tranquility. These periods would bring ceasefires that could serve as national immunization days where large numbers of people could receive a vaccine. The Civil War in El Salvador was halted for 3 Sundays in 1985 for such mass vaccinations. During that time, 2/3 of the nation's children were immunized. Another National Immunization Day took place in Lebanon in 1987. Arranged by the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, the vaccine was made available in certain so-called corridors of peace. These wouldn't be the last. From 1990 to 2000, Days of Tranquility allowed mass immunizations across Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, South America, and Central America. In 1985, Rotary International initiated its Polio Plus campaign. According to the organization, less than half of the world's children had been immunized against polio at the time. However, by 1992, more than 80% had received the vaccine. To raise funds for distributing the vaccine, Rotary worked alongside other groups like UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the Pan American Health Organization. And in 1988, they lobbied the World Health Assembly itself for a resolution to eradicate polio. Rotary International subsequently became a founding member of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. In the interests of combating polio, the GPEI, as it's known, brings national governments together with private actors like the Centers for Disease Control, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Despite the fact that the World Health Organization set the year 2000 as their goal for eradicating polio, the fight continues to this very day. Wild polio was eradicated in the Americas in 1994, the Western Pacific in 2000, and Europe in 2020. However, according to the GPEI, the epidemic still remains in some parts of the world. On the upside, in 2019, the WHO confirmed the eradication of type 3 polio virus. Type 2 had been defeated in 2015, though several vaccine-derived cases have arisen in Nigeria since that time. Type 1 and vaccine-derived cases of type 2, however, remain widespread in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. Many of these vaccine-derived cases occurred because the oral vaccine, which became more widely used due to its easy administration and low cost, contains a live virus. This means that there's a small chance of contracting the virus from the oral vaccine itself. How small a chance? The numbers tell us it's about 1 out of every 2.5 million doses. For these reasons, the oral vaccine is no longer used, and as of 2019, the injected vaccine is what is employed in every country. Vaccines will be required until all 3 strains of polio have been completely eliminated. The GPEI continues to work toward that goal. Until that mission is fulfilled, the organization will continue to work towards safer vaccines and wider inoculation. From 1892 to 1954, millions of immigrants arriving in America were examined and treated at Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. In fact, it's said that nearly half of Americans can trace the roots of an ancestor to the site. Amazingly, despite millions of people coming through the hospital, the concept of hygiene was only just emerging at the time. So, today we're going to take a look at what hospital hygiene was like on Ellis Island. Now give me your homeless, tempest-tossed to me. We shall lift our lamp beside the golden door. Anyone who has ever seen The Godfather Part 2 might have a mental image of what the journey through Ellis Island looked like for an immigrant. The film features a sequence where a young Vito Andolini passes through the island while immigrating to the United States in 1901. Officials at the facility are unable to pronounce Vito's last name and haphazardly replace it with the name of his hometown, Corleone. They mark him with an X inside a circle, indicating they suspected him of having a mental defect, and then quarantined him for suspected smallpox. While it is a highly dramatic and memorable sequence, it's not completely accurate. The idea that immigrants' names were changed on Ellis Island is actually just a myth. In fact, the names of the immigrants were gathered on the ship manifests in Europe, and the officials at Ellis Island merely confirmed what they read from those manifests. However, while that part wasn't true, the medical inspections and psychological scrutiny Vito underwent were on the money. Making sure immigrants like Vito were healthy, sane, and, most importantly, capable of working was the facility's top priority. When thinking of the year 1892, one may guess that medical facilities at the time consisted of only small and in-home practices. However, that was far from the case when it came to Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. The establishment was truly massive, housing 16 contagious disease wards as well as 6 infectious disease wards. While the facility employed only a handful of doctors at any given point, they were supported by dozens of nurses. When considering the millions that passed through the hospital in order to be cleared to enter the United States, the number of rejections was actually quite small, coming in at less than 2%. Most migrants were cleared within seconds or hours of being admitted. While more than 12 million walked through the doors of Ellis Island Hospital during its duration, the number of admittances often reached 100 in a day, sometimes more. And every hopeful immigrant aboard any steamship was required to undergo medical examinations to be cleared to enter the country. Considering how few doctors were on hand at any given time, the hospital operations flowed with remarkable efficiency, day in and day out. If you're wondering exactly how many doctors there actually were, records show that when the facility opened in 1892, they employed only 6 medical doctors. 10 years later, that number had only increased to 8 physicians, despite the fact that in the same period, the traffic of immigrants had more than doubled, from 200,000 people a year to 500,000 people per year. By 1905, that number had almost doubled again, with roughly 900,000 immigrants a year coming through the facility. They finally doubled the size of the medical staff as well, employing 16 doctors. In 1925, they were up to 25 doctors working in 4 assembly line-style inspection teams. An examination at the Ellis Island Hospital started with making the patients walk up a large number of steps in order for specialists to monitor for breathing and other visible health issues. After that was completed, the immigrants faced eyeball inspections. Trachoma, also known as pink eye, and sometimes referred to as chlamydia of the eye, was a particularly scary diagnosis to receive. Doctors used their index fingers or a button hook to lift up eyelids and inspect people for the disease. Since that illness is easily cured today with antibiotics, it can be difficult to accept that if a patient was infected back then, the prognosis was extremely grim. In fact, a majority of sufferers ended up blind after enduring extensive surgeries and treatments involving hazardous chemicals. In 1905, then President Theodore Roosevelt, now famous for his association with the Rough Riders, the Bull Moose Party, and the Teddy Bear, visited Ellis Island. While there, the president, who was far from being the squeamish type, found himself unsettled by some of the techniques being used to examine the migrants. For example, Roosevelt noted that medical workers used unwashed hands and unsanitary medical tools when processing patients. In retrospect, such practices may seem inexplicable, but considering the resources available at the time, healthcare workers could not have been aware of the numerous risks that would become common knowledge in the subsequent years. On the upside, Roosevelt's observations eventually led to the sanitary implementations that modern medical facilities now have in place, including things like hand washing and the sterilization of medical tools. Patients at Ellis Island Hospital who had questionable mental or physical capacity were made to be quarantined and separated from their peers. This involved living grueling hours alone in a kind of solitary confinement for hopeful settlers. And many of you may have first-hand experience knowing that living through quarantine is not fun. The process for those hoping to pass through Ellis Island could take anywhere from days to years to complete. And unlike in modern times, they had to endure quarantine without the benefit of a television to watch or an internet that kept them in touch with loved ones and the outside world. The doctors at Ellis Island didn't know what we know today about hygiene, but they knew enough to make every effort to keep sleeping areas clean. In order to ensure the cleanest resting area possible, physicians sterilized mattresses with the use of an autoclave and fluoroscopy. High heat cleaning and sterilization methods ensured patients could get the rest they needed in a sterile environment. And this didn't just help the patients. The doctors themselves could inevitably rest better as well, knowing this would reduce the risk of cross-contamination. The doctors examining immigrants coming into Ellis Island had massive numbers of patients to see and limited time and resources for their examinations. This meant setting medical priorities. As such, the doctors focused largely on searching for fungal infections and skin conditions. Hands, scalps, nails, and skin were all thoroughly inspected. Officials were looking for potential disease, as well as other conditions, such as ringworm. These tests, like the others, were primarily intended to confirm if a potential migrant was healthy enough to work. Dozens of immigrants waiting to learn their fate were forced into fenced areas and sat on overcrowded benches. The areas were noisy, as the spaces were typically at maximum capacity. The wait was likely incredibly stressful, since those who didn't pass the exam would be held for further testing. As immigration ramped up, making sure Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital was as hygienic as possible became of the utmost importance. Employees were required to take decontamination showers to ensure the facility was kept as sanitary as possible. The showers were meant to reduce the risk of acquiring any illnesses or diseases that arrived on the island. Ellis Island physicians also wore hairnets, which were originally made of materials seen in hats at the time. This protected them from the heat of overhead lights in the examination rooms. When visiting a clinic today, most people are accustomed to a certain level of hygienic care. Like, for example, doctors that wear face masks and gloves when conducting examinations and administering treatments. That wasn't always the case. But Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital was revolutionary in that it was among the first medical establishments in the United States to implement the use of exactly that equipment. These strict standards ensured that everything possible was being done to avoid disease through cross-contamination. Eventually, the practice caught on, and today nearly all medical facilities have followed suit. In fact, standards like the ones pioneered at Ellis Island are now enforced by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. While it's true that doctors at Ellis Island were making pioneering innovations that would hold up to this day, it's also true that they were also engaging in practices that relied on some questionable standards. For example, for those looking to quickly settle into the United States, it was important that their physical appearance was up to par. People were examined to make sure their faces had proper symmetry and knew they would be questioned if they suffered any physical impairments. Because of the initial strict standards of processing, many attempted to hide what might delay or deny their entry. This included such things as deformed extremities. If they didn't pass their exams, migrants were separated from loved ones and kept for further evaluation. In the initial stages of transporting immigrants to America, steamship companies took advantage of the situation. They charged people large sums of money for transport, but only gave them minimal food and accommodations during their voyage. Even worse, these companies often allowed sickly passengers to board their ships, knowing they could collect the transport fee whether or not the individual was allowed into the country. And at first, practices like these had absolutely no repercussions. However, that changed when authorities in the United States initiated laws that largely curbed those tendencies. From then on, the steamship companies were on the hook for providing accommodations for those held back at Ellis Island, as well as a mode of transport for those migrants who were denied entry. Once the steamship companies stood to lose more than they made, they cleaned up their act real fast. Imagine entering a new country and not knowing their language. Despite the fact that the United States has not declared an official language, this was the case for a large majority of settlers when it came to speaking English. Anxiety is bound to run rampant in such a situation, and people may not subsequently act how they normally would. This could snowball into a major problem since a person who appeared to be peculiar, physically or mentally speaking, risked being stopped for further evaluation. Those who did not appear mentally sound were often deemed as having psychopathic tendencies. Migrants were healthy but who didn't speak English were often criticized as unfit because due to the language barrier, they couldn't follow orders from medical staff. Even worse, many were forced to take a virtually incomprehensible IQ test, and a poor score would be considered evidence of a mental defect. People who were diagnosed as being ill would be placed in the island's contagious disease hospital. A court would then decide if the migrant could stay or be sent back to their place of origin. So what do you think? Did any of your relatives go through Ellis Island? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.